You know that thing that happens when you have been tolerating something for a long time, and then one day you just stop? Not dramatically, not with a big speech or a confrontation. You just become internally unavailable for it in a way that feels almost quiet, almost settled. Like a decision that got made somewhere below your conscious awareness and then surfaced fully formed. Not because anything in the external situation changed. The situation is exactly what it was. But your relationship to it shifted while you were not paying attention, and now you can see it without the protective softening that was once keeping you comfortable in it. That is the energy of today. March 8th, 2026. Venus conjunct Saturn at 2 degrees and 38 minutes of Aries, exact at 9:39 a.m. Eastern Time. And if you have been feeling unusually clear about what you are willing to accept, unusually honest about where something is not working, unusually firm in a way that does not feel angry but just feels like a fact, that is not a mood. That is not just Mercury retrograde in Pisces stirring things up from the inside. That is this transit doing exactly what it came here to do, which is hand you a kind of structural clarity about love, relationships, values, and what you are genuinely prepared to invest in that you do not get very often, and that, once it arrives, tends to stay. I want to be precise about what is actually happening in the sky today, because it is more specific than it might sound on paper. Venus, the planet that governs love, attraction, relationships, beauty, money, and what we genuinely value, is sitting in an exact conjunction with Saturn, the planet of structure, discipline, honest assessment, and long-term consequences. They are meeting in Aries, which is the sign of directness, raw initiative, and the refusal to wait around for something to maybe get better. You put those three things together, and what you get is a moment where your understanding of what a relationship, a partnership, a financial situation, or a creative commitment actually is, and what it should be, becomes sharper than it has been in a while. And I want to say right from the start, this is not a romantic transit in the conventional sense. This is not the sky handing you butterflies and soft lighting and sudden declarations. Venus conjunct Saturn does not operate in that register. What it does is something more substantial. It hands you clarity. It hands you the ability to look at something you have been a little hazy about and see it clearly, see it honestly, see it in its actual dimensions rather than in the version your hopes have been projecting onto it. That is not less romantic. Depending on what you have been carrying, it might be exactly what you need. If this is landing, go ahead and leave a like and subscribe. I put these out regularly. And drop "I see it clearly now" in the comments. I want to see who is already feeling this kind of settled internal clarity today. Okay, let me get into the actual mechanics of this, because there is a lot here worth understanding properly. Before we can talk about what today means for relationships and love and values specifically, I need to spend a minute on Venus and Saturn as a pair, because the way they interact is counterintuitive in a way that trips a lot of people up. Most people hear Venus conjunct Saturn and they picture something restrictive, harsh, love meeting the cold hand of limitation. And in some contexts, yes, Saturn does represent restriction, but that is not what Saturn is doing at its core. At its core, Saturn is the planet of reality, of things that are actually true rather than things we want to be true, of what holds over time versus what only works when conditions are perfect, of what you are genuinely willing to build versus what you just feel good imagining. And when Venus, the planet of what you want and who you love and what you find beautiful, meets Saturn, the planet of what is real and durable and worth your actual investment, what you get is a moment of honest reckoning, not a punishment, a calibration. The two planets together are essentially forcing the question, is what I am reaching toward real, or have I been in love with a version of this that I constructed? That is not a comfortable question, but it is a useful one. And the Aries placement makes it more direct than it would be in a water sign or a mutable sign. Aries does not do ambiguity. Aries does not let you soften the question into something more manageable. Aries asks it straight without apology, and it expects a straight answer. The last time Venus and Saturn came together in Aries was not recent. Saturn moved into Aries on February 13th of this year, and Venus entered Aries on March 6th, just 2 days ago. This is their first exact conjunction in this sign, and given that Saturn will be in Aries until April 2028, this conjunction sets the relational tone for a longer arc than just today. What becomes clear in this window tends to remain clear. What you see honestly about a relationship or a commitment today does not unsee itself. And to really appreciate why this moment carries weight, it is worth going back in the historical record a bit, because the last time Saturn was in Aries was between June 1996 and June 1999. That is almost 30 years ago. People who were navigating significant relationships in that period, people who were learning hard lessons about what they were and were not willing to accept in partnership, what their non-negotiable standards actually were, what it felt like to stay in something past its natural end versus what it felt like to hold their own standard, even at some cost to comfort. Those were Saturn in Aries lessons. They were lessons about the structural integrity of the self in the context of love and commitment. We are back in that same sign now. The specific circumstances in your life are different, obviously. You are a different person than you were in 1997 or 1998, if you were alive then. But the fundamental question Saturn in Aries poses to love is the same. It is always the same. Who are you, independent of what other people want you to be, and are you willing to hold that truth in a relationship rather than quietly dissolving into whatever shape the other person prefers you to take? Today, with Venus sitting exactly on top of Saturn at 2 degrees and 38 minutes of Aries, that question gets applied directly and personally to what you love, what you pursue, what you reach toward and call valuable. This is not an abstract or collective question. It is specific to your actual life. That is worth sitting with for a moment. The clarity available on March 8th is not a temporary emotional state. It is a structural understanding. And structural understandings change how you operate going forward, often more quietly and durably than any dramatic confrontation ever does. Here is something I want to add to this picture that I think shifts how you understand what is available today. Saturn entered Aries just 3 weeks ago on February 13th, and in that 3 weeks, it has been settling into the part of your chart ruled by Aries, which is the area of your life where you are being asked to be more direct, more individually courageous, more honest about what you actually want, independent of what other people expect from you or need from you. But there is also something important in the specific degree where this conjunction is happening. 2 degrees and 38 minutes of Aries. Neptune is at approximately 1 degree of Aries right now. Saturn is at approximately 2 to 3 degrees of Aries. Venus is meeting Saturn at that same degree. What that means is that Venus is passing through a space in the zodiac that has been shaped very recently by the Saturn-Neptune conjunction of February 20th. That Saturn-Neptune conjunction at 0 degrees and 44 minutes of Aries was one of the rarest and most significant alignments of this decade. 2 planets whose energies are almost opposites, sitting in exact conjunction. Saturn brings reality, structure, and the limits of what is actually possible. Neptune brings vision, idealism, and the blurring of those limits. When they came together in Aries in February, the collective question that alignment posed was, where have we been living in an idealized version of something rather than the actual thing? And what does it cost to see clearly? Venus moving through that exact degree space today and meeting Saturn there is like arriving at a site where something significant already happened and finding that it has permanently altered the ground. The relational clarity available on March 8th is shaped by that Neptune backdrop. It is clarity that knows the difference between what is genuinely beautiful and worth reaching toward and what is beautiful only because we were not looking at it closely. Saturn and Neptune together in Aries spent February teaching us to see the difference. Venus arriving at that degree today is asking us to apply that distinction specifically to who and what we love. Saturn in Aries, in its core expression, is about the discipline of having your own backbone. Not in an aggressive or combative way, though Aries energy can tip that direction if it is not integrated well. more in the sense of knowing what you stand for and being willing to stand there even when it is inconvenient, even when it would be easier to go along with something, even when the other person in the room would prefer you to be more accommodating. Saturn in Aries is about the structural integrity of the self, of not bending so much that you lose the shape of what you are. And here is where that becomes particularly relevant to today's Venus conjunction. Venus in Aries is already a placement that wants what it wants without apology. Venus in Aries does not like to wait. It does not like to hedge. It wants to reach toward things directly, honestly, with the kind of straightforwardness that Aries brings to everything. But Venus in Aries can also be impulsive in relationships. It can want something intensely in the moment, without always having the patience to check whether that thing is real and sustainable, or whether it just feels exciting right now. Saturn sitting right on top of Venus today is providing exactly the corrective for that impulsiveness. It is not killing the desire, it is asking the desire to hold up under honest scrutiny. And what survives that scrutiny, what feels just as true and just as worth reaching toward even after Saturn's honest gaze has passed over it, that is what is real for you. That is the desire worth following. That is the relationship worth investing in. That is the creative project or financial commitment worth making with genuine intention rather than just enthusiasm. And on the other side of that, what does not survive the scrutiny? What looks different in this honest light than it did in the warmer, more hopeful atmosphere of the past few weeks? That information is equally valuable. Maybe more so. Because knowing clearly that something is not what you thought it was is the beginning of making genuinely different choices. And genuinely different choices are the beginning of genuinely different outcomes. I want to bring in a second transit that is operating in the background of today, and that changes the atmosphere in an important way, because if you only pay attention to Venus conjunct Saturn, you might assume today is entirely heavy and serious. It is not. While Venus is meeting Saturn in Aries and doing that honest reckoning work, Mercury retrograde in Pisces is forming a trine with Jupiter retrograde in Cancer. The exact aspect hits at 1:23 a.m. Eastern on March 9th, which means it is building in strength all through March 8th, the entire day. And a trine between Mercury and Jupiter is about as philosophically optimistic an aspect as the sky produces. Mercury trine. Jupiter opens the mind. It expands the way you think. It makes you more willing to see beyond the immediate situation to the larger picture, to the longer arc, to the meaning behind the detail. It produces the kind of thinking that is generous rather than brittle, curious rather than defensive, more interested in understanding than in being right. And because Mercury is retrograde in Pisces right now, that expansive thinking has a particularly inward and intuitive quality. It is not the Mercury trine Jupiter that makes you want to call everyone you know and talk at length. It is the version that produces deep private realizations, the kind of insight that arrives quietly in the middle of doing something ordinary. Put the two transits together, and what you have is this. Saturn and Venus in Aries providing structural honesty about what is and is not real in your relationships and values, while Mercury and Jupiter in water signs provide the philosophical generosity and intuitive depth to understand why things are the way they are and what the honest picture actually means for where you are going. The Saturn-Venus conjunction gives you the map as it actually is. The Mercury-Jupiter trine gives you the perspective to read that map without falling into despair about it. That combination is genuinely powerful. The honesty without the harshness, the reckoning without the cruelty, the clear picture with enough altitude to understand it rather than just feel overwhelmed by it. And there is one more thing worth noting in this background. Jupiter is retrograde at 15 degrees Cancer right now, and it stations direct on March 10th, which is 2 days from today. Jupiter has been retrograde since November 9th of 2025. That is 4 months of Jupiter in its exaltation sign moving inward, building emotional understanding, clarifying what genuinely nourishes you and what you have been settling for because it is comfortable or familiar, or because you do not yet believe you can have what you actually want. When Jupiter stations direct on March 10th, all of that internal work starts looking for external expression. The emotional clarity that has been building in whatever area of your chart Cancer rules is about to start moving outward, finding form, seeking its natural direction in the world. Today's Venus-Saturn conjunction and the Mercury-Jupiter trine building in the background are essentially the final interior reckoning before Jupiter's upward movement begins. What you see clearly on March 8th is what Jupiter in Cancer direct gets to build from on March 10th and beyond. These are not isolated events, they are sequential. Let me talk about the signs that are sitting in the most direct path of today's transits, because for some of you, this is hitting specific houses in a way that makes it very concrete and personal. Aries, you are the sign where both Venus and Saturn are sitting right now, which means this conjunction is landing in your first house if you are an Aries rising, or in a different but personally significant house if you are an Aries sun or moon. Either way, the personal stakes are high. For Aries specifically, this transit is about your relationship to what you want, not whether you want things, because Aries always wants things and pursues them. The question Saturn is raising is whether what you are currently pursuing is genuinely aligned with your values, or whether you have been chasing something because you decided it was good for you a while ago and have not stopped to reassess. Aries has a tendency to commit to a direction and then stay committed out of sheer force of will, even when the circumstances have changed. Saturn in your sign is asking you to be as brave about reassessment as you are about pursuit. The same courage that makes you chase something down is the courage required to look honestly at whether it is worth chasing. That is the work available to you today. Libra, you are the opposite sign from Aries, which means this conjunction in Aries is operating in your 7th house, the house of partnerships, marriage, close one-on-one relationships, and significant others. For Libra, Venus conjunct Saturn in Aries is asking you to do something that does not come naturally to you, which is to hold your own position in a partnership rather than reorganizing yourself around the other person's needs and preferences. Libra is the sign that genuinely wants harmony, and that desire for harmony is real and beautiful. But Saturn in your 7th house is pointing out the places where your pursuit of harmony has required you to swallow things that should not have been swallowed, to accept arrangements that do not actually work for you, to be so committed to the partnership functioning that you have been letting your own needs go unacknowledged. The clarity available to Libra today is specifically about what you have been giving without reciprocity and what happens if you simply stop giving it without replacement and see what remains. That is not a comfortable exercise, but it is an honest one. Cancer, you are in an interesting position today, because Jupiter is sitting in your sign, retrograde, about to station direct 2 days from now. Jupiter in Cancer is in its exaltation, which means it is operating at full strength, fully at home, fully capable of delivering what it promises. But Jupiter retrograde in Cancer has been doing interior work for 4 months. If you are a Cancer rising or sun, you have likely been processing something about what home means to you, what emotional security actually requires, what you have been calling nourishment, that is actually just familiarity dressed up as something more. The Venus-Saturn conjunction today is directly square your Jupiter, which creates some friction. That friction is productive. It is the tension between what you have been internally clarifying, Jupiter in Cancer, and what the external relational picture actually looks like, Venus-Saturn in Aries square Cancer. What you see in that tension today is the gap between the life you have been quietly building toward on the inside and the dynamics you have been tolerating on the outside. Jupiter direct in 2 days is going to start closing that gap. But today is the day you see the gap clearly. Capricorn, Venus and Saturn in Aries are operating in your 4th house, the house of home, roots, family, and the private foundations of your life. And Saturn is your ruling planet, which means you have a particular relationship with its energy that other signs do not. You understand Saturn's demands. You know how to work with restriction and honest assessment and the discipline of doing what needs doing, even when it is not enjoyable. But the fourth house placement of this conjunction is asking you to apply that Saturnian honesty to something more private than your career or your public responsibilities. It is asking you to look at what is happening at the level of your actual home life, your family relationships, the domestic arrangements and emotional foundations that other people never see. What do those foundations actually look like right now? What is stable and what is load-bearing that should not be? That is the question on the table for Capricorn today, and your natural capacity for honest structural assessment is exactly the right tool for it. For everyone who is not one of these four signs, you are still feeling today's energy. You feel it in whatever house Aries occupies in your chart. Look at where 0 to 5 degrees of Aries falls for you. And that is the area of life where Venus conjunct Saturn is doing its honest reckoning work. The themes may be different, but the quality is the same. Real clarity about what is and is not working, what is worth sustaining, and what has run its course, what you are genuinely willing to build, and what you have been maintaining mostly out of inertia. Practical territory, because that is where this actually matters, and I want to be genuinely specific here rather than staying in the general territory where most astrology content parks itself. One thing worth doing today, and I mean this quite literally, is sitting with a situation or a relationship that you have been somewhat unclear about and asking the Saturn question rather than the Venus question. The Venus question is, do I want this? The Saturn question is this real? Is it actually what I have been telling myself it is? And is it worth the investment of my actual time and emotional labor over the long term? Those are different questions. Venus leads with desire. Saturn leads with honest assessment. On any other day, desire is a perfectly good guide. But on Venus conjunct Saturn day, in Aries, in a waning moon phase with Mercury retrograde still active, the Saturn question is the more useful one. Ask it honestly, and then let yourself hear the answer without immediately softening it into something more comfortable. Here is a more specific version of that exercise. Think about the relationship or commitment in question and ask yourself how long you would be willing to wait for it to become what you actually need it to be. Not how long you have already waited. How long you would, with genuine willingness and without resentment, continue waiting. If the honest answer is something like, I have already been waiting longer than I would have agreed to if someone had told me at the start, that is Saturn talking. That is the honest inventory of time and emotional investment that Saturn in Aries is uniquely good at prompting. The Aries element means you do not have to be diplomatic about the answer you find. Aries respects directness, even internally directness. The waning gibbous moon that is operating right now, sitting at roughly 78% illumination, is moving toward a new moon on March 18th at 28 degrees Pisces. Waning phases are releasing phases. They are not the time to initiate and build. They are the time to let go, to complete, to allow things that have reached their natural conclusion to reach it without interference. Venus conjunct Saturn in a waning moon is particularly suited to releasing relational patterns rather than initiating new ones. The new energy, the initiating, the reaching towards something fresh that comes when Jupiter turns direct in 2 days and the moon begins its new cycle on March 18th. Today is about seeing clearly and releasing what the clear sight reveals as unnecessary. Be specially honest about the difference between a relationship that is genuinely worth working on and a relationship that you are working on because you do not want to admit the working has been one-sided for longer than you want to count. Saturn in Aries does not have patience for self-deception in this area. It does not have patience for the story. You tell yourself to avoid the discomfort of an honest inventory. And the thing about Saturn in Aries specifically is that its honesty has a quality of frank directness that can feel abrupt if you have been running a particularly comfortable story. Better to come to the reckoning yourself, deliberately on your own terms, than to have the reckoning arrive in an external form you did not choose and did not prepare for. On the financial and values side of Venus, Because Venus governs more than just romantic relationships, today is genuinely useful for taking a clear look at where your spending and your stated priorities have drifted apart. This is a transit that makes that drift visible in a way it might not be on other days. Not to punish yourself about it, but to see it as the factual information it is and decide whether you want to make a structural adjustment. Saturn respects structural adjustments. It does not particularly respect emotional resolve that does not translate into behavioral change. So if something becomes clear on the financial front today, the Saturn move is to make one small, concrete adjustment, not to write a lengthy journal entry about your feelings about it, but to actually change one thing, however small, that brings your behavior into alignment with what you say you value. One more thing that I think is specifically worth saying about today's Mercury, Jupiter trine, and how it applies practically if you receive an insight today, a genuine internal realization, the kind that arrives with unusual clarity and lands with a quality of being simply true rather than being argued into existence. Write it down immediately and do not edit it. Mercury retrograde in Pisces gives back the insights that the retrograde initially obscured, but it gives them back in Piscean language, which is associative and imagistic and tends to dissolve if you do not capture it in the moment before the ordinary analytical mind gets hold of it and starts questioning whether it was real. Mercury trine, Jupiter gives that Piscean insight an unusual quality of spaciousness and confidence. But it is still Mercury retrograde in Pisces, which means it speaks sideways. Catch it sideways. Write it down in whatever form it arrives before the revision starts. The revision can come later. The first version of the insight is the one worth keeping. I want to close with a picture of where this is going because I think it is genuinely useful to understand March 8th in context rather than in isolation. When you see what comes after, what you are doing today makes more sense as a necessary step rather than simply a demanding moment. 2 days from now, March 10th, Jupiter stations direct at 15 degrees and 5 minutes of Cancer at 11:29 p.m. Eastern. This is a significant planetary station. Jupiter has been retrograde since November 9th of 2025. And when a planet of Jupiter's size turns direct after 4 months of backward motion, the change in the quality of available energy is noticeable, sometimes dramatically so. Jupiter in Cancer direct is warm and generative and emotionally abundant in an outward-facing way rather than an inward one. It is the difference between understanding what genuinely nourishes you and actually building your life around that understanding. Between knowing what kind of love you want and actually letting yourself reach toward it with conviction. Everything that becomes clear on March 8th through the honest lens of Venus conjunct Saturn is what Jupiter in Cancer direct gets to build from starting March 10th. This is not accidental sequencing. The universe is not handing you the clarity and then ignoring what you do with it. The clarity is the foundation. Jupiter direct is the construction that begins on top of it. But you cannot build well on a foundation you have not honestly assessed. That is what today is for. Clear sight first, generous expansion second. Then March 20th, Mercury stations direct at 8 degrees and 30 minutes of Pisces at 3:32 p.m. Eastern. Same day, the Sun moves into Aries at 10:46 a.m. Eastern for the astrological New Year. March 22nd, Neptune Cazimi. March 25th, Saturn Cazimi. The entire back half of this month is a sequence of clarification moving into forward motion, each transit building on what the previous one established. And the thing is, all of it is more useful and more honest and more directionally clear if what you see on March 8th actually lands rather than getting softened into something more comfortable before you have had a chance to receive it fully. The astrological New Year on March 20th is genuinely different depending on what kind of foundation you arrive at it carrying. So that is what today asks. Not drama, not confrontation, not big declarations or grand gestures, just honesty. The honest assessment of what is real and what is worth sustaining and what has been running on borrowed time. The honest question about whether the thing you have been calling love or commitment or investment is the real thing or the version of it that you constructed because the real thing felt too uncertain to trust. Venus conjunct Saturn in Aries does not do the soft version of that question. It does the direct version. And the people who are willing to receive the direct version without softening it, without immediately reaching for an explanation that makes everything okay, those are the people who arrive at March 20th, at the equinox, at the astrological new year, with something genuine to build from rather than something they are still explaining to themselves. That is the invitation. Take it or leave it, but it will not be offered quite this clearly again for a while. The sky moves on. Jupiter turns direct in 2 days. The new moon comes on March 18th. The window for this particular quality of honest reckoning closes. Use it while it is open. If this resonated, leave a like and subscribe, and drop "I see it clearly now" in the comments below. Tell me your rising sign down there too if you want. I read every one of those. March 10th is 2 days out and the Jupiter direct shift is going to feel real. I will be covering it. Take care of yourselves through this retrograde. See you in the next one.